again. I do recall back in 2019 and early 2020, it became quite a battle over whose advice was better. And it did seem to me at the time, and I don't in a way blame the government for this, that the NCSC gave poor advice to the government about the security risk, and I think it was tempered by the need of the government to want to go ahead and get 5G moving. And I think this is always the problem that you face, that if organisations are to advise government about security risks, then they have to be completely separated on the basis that that is their advice, and they don't temper it to suit the governments. We've seen this happen all the way through. It's not just this particular government, I think, made the right decision, but I'll come back to that. But also, if we go back, it is also Labour governments and Conservative governments of the past. Successive governments have underestimated the risk, the growing risk, particularly the risk coming from China, but there are other countries. They already were aware of the risk from Russia. And I do agree with my honourable friends, always a pleasure to be in the same debate as him, over his reference to the ISC's ability to scrutinise. I do think that, if I might say so to my honourable friend, who I have a huge amount of time for, as he knows, and we have debated ad nauseum some of this, but I do say to him that I think the government is going to have to come back to this process. I think it will add value. There's no question that the parliamentary scrutiny process through this committee of my honourable friends, the ISC, will add value and strengthen government legislation going forward. And I do hope that the government does use, even if they don't want to accept the particularly new Clause 2, I think it is, but do, in principle, come back to this and use this committee. I think it can only strengthen and counterbalance other pressures that may exist from other companies outside. So I do, of course, therefore, agree that this bill does require our support. Its main aims of strengthening security and resilience in the UK's telecommunications infrastructure absolutely goes without saying. All these struggles over Huawei were just part of that process. Giving stronger powers to the Secretary of State and Ofcom to enforce the new duties on telecom providers to increase the security and resilience of their networks is also critical, and the third element of giving new national security powers to the Secretary of State to impose restrictions, I want to come back to this, on telecoms providers. And this is regarding their equipment and the equipment from high-risk vendors. Now, I did lay an amendment, myself and some of my honourable friends, and I had hoped to be coming to debate that, but clearly it wasn't selected. But I think I'm going to select the principles of that particular amendment, if the Madam Deputy Speaker, you don't mind, even though it's not there, it is there in spirit. And the point that I was wanting to make with this particular amendment was that it would require, essentially, the Secretary of State to make a designated vendor direction for any firm which is required to hand over its data to government or intelligence services of a foreign country. The reason why I wanted, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be quite so specific in this, to use what was already in the bill, but to force the government a little bit to go further, is because I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary because right now I think we are facing a number of particular threats, but I think in this regard a lot of hidden threats that hide behind the idea, particularly from China, that they are independent companies, independent of their government. This is simply not the case. I cannot think of a single company registered in China, not Hong Kong, but in China, that is not somehow linked directly or indirectly, but nonetheless under control of the Chinese government. And it's worth repeating the Article 14 of China's 2017 National Intelligence Law, which obliges all firms to give the government assistance in areas of intelligence and national security if requested. And perhaps this quote is useful. It's a translation, so it may be slightly to be modified. But it says, state intelligence work organs, when legally carrying forth intelligence work, may demand that concerned organs, organisations or citizens provide needed support, assistance and cooperation. And this is critical because this requires those organisations to do whatever is required of them with regards to data transfer. Now, this is peculiar in a way, but it would be peculiar even if it were just dealing with Russia. But the fact that we're dealing with China which has a very much larger commercial base in all of these areas. In fact, it's quite interesting to bear back at had other governments, going back further, recognized the nature of what was going on, they would have seen that there is a strategic plan from the Chinese Communist Party to dominate key commercial areas. Rare earth materials, they own 85% of those. Rare earth materials are, as one was said the other day, the oil of the 21st century, without which we simply won't be able to operate. But they don't stop there. They also own all of the processing capability, particularly the large share in the world. So they strategically look ahead, look at the areas, telecommunications. We had, 10 to 15 companies globally engaged in this about 12 years ago, one of which was Marconi here in the UK. There is today only 3 non-Chinese companies in existence that can build a 5G system, and not one of them, by the way, is in the United States. That tells you just exactly how that market has been infiltrated and destroyed. People talked about market failure when we discussed the Huawei bill. It was not market failure. It was the fact that a government, with its institutions, has set out strategically to destroy a market and dominate it. And that was one of the excuses used by my government, which is that we had no other options, but we had to go for what was there in the marketplace. Well, that has now changed, and I'm pleased about that. So this amendment was necessary because lying behind all of this is the real key, which is these companies are not free, and they do not protect data in the way that we would expect. And they're not alone, by the way. Huawei is just one company. I mean, there's lots of others. ByteDance that owns TikTok. I really question the degree to which they own that data now and are able to use it. Data on many, many people, particularly many of our younger generation. And these requirements of the national intelligence law apply not just, as I say, to Huawei and co, because they dominate the nature of the process that they are engaged in dominating that data and their use of that data, which is critical. So I'm pleased that the government, with this bill, demonstrates now that it's got it, absolutely got the point, and I pay credit to my honourable friend who has been in this process and honest and straight from the beginning about his recognition of this particular problem. So that is now the case. But we are just but stepping tentatively in the direction of this understanding. Because when we look at this, and I ask myself, in the other place, I think the Trade Minister said that the government, this government, was still determined to pursue deeper bilateral trade, as a quote, with China, while sanctions against many of our parliamentarians, myself included, by the way, but there are some others here now, are in place, yet we still just kind of step that to one side and think that we can go ahead trying to make these deeper relations with China, notwithstanding the fact we also recognise they're a remarkable threat. I simply don't understand how we square these two things and get on with it. Was my honourable friend wanting to intervene?
No,
I thought she did, sorry.
It's a joy to never waste. It's obviously a joy to intervene on my right, my friend. It was that very point you were making, is how deeper can our relationships go with a country that has sanctioned parliamentarians in this House for basically raising human rights abuses and security concerns.
I'm getting so used to just doing what I'm told by my honourable friend when it's necessary that she only has to look in this direction and I give way to her. My apologies. But what I was really trying to get to the bottom of is that I don't think this is feasible any longer, and I think this process, this bill illustrates the dichotomy that lies at the heart of the government's position on this. We are trying constantly to talk about these trade relationships, but at the same time we recognise that the country that we are discussing that with is a totalitarian state that is guilty of what many, myself, believe is a genocide of a whole ethnic group, more than one ethnic group, is intolerant, it is suppressing democracy and free speech in Hong Kong, and is threatening Taiwan, India, possess the South China Sea. You can go on for the list of these things, and yet at the same time recognise that all of those things compile, but also as a security risk, and then in the other place we are told, don't worry, we're still trying to do trade deals. And it's quite interesting about this because we have reopened an economic and financial dialogue under JETCO, which is a joint economic trade cooperation which was paused because originally of the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong. These discussions have now restarted again. We didn't get much fanfare on that, I think. We sort of discovered that they restarted, but there was no announcement from the dispatch box that we were restarting these. Although there's no dates particularly involved in this, despite these sanctions against individuals, etc., and our sanctions against Chinese officials, still I wish we could do more. And I note also the other day that the European Union was heading in the same direction with their agreement, only now, because of the sanctions on their MEPs, etc., have actually decided no, they aren't going to do that. So I simply raise the question, if we think that this country, this government, the Chinese Communist Party, the government of China, is such a potential threat, should we really be trying to reopen those doors, despite the sanctions we've in place, despite the sanctions they put in place, and despite the very clear threat that they now pose to our security in this? So I simply say to my honourable friend, I was going to move my amendment, but that was going to say to them that they should immediately declare many of these companies as high-risk vendors and do it by the very nature of the security law that exists in China. I also do, however, say, in support of what has been said already, that I do think that the government does need to use the internal possibilities in our Parliament. We have a committee that is cleared to see the highest level of security in these areas, and I do think it's very important that if we use that committee and the government gets that private advice from the committee about what they think is going wrong with their particular position, I think it will benefit them and improve them. So I ask my right honourable friend to take in consideration both the amendment that would have been in this paper, to answer that at the end when he sums up, but to seriously think about how we can strengthen this more, and if he can, make the reservations of this place felt to his colleagues in government, that we are deeply concerned about trying to ride two separate bicycles at the same time. One, recognising a deep and growing threat to democracy, not just here but around the world, from that threat which is now the Chinese Communist Party of China, and two, trying to beg them to do trade deals with us, notwithstanding the fact that they behave so badly.
We now go to Jamie Stone.